in improving the quality of spending in the local government. This is the issue of local the general block grant and specific grant. We also pay more attention in borrowing. We learned from our colleague from Latin America that, well, borrowing is good for the quote-unquote good local government. But since we realize in Indonesia, the variation of the local government is varied. So we have to begin with the very prudent policy. So the borrowing just given for fulfilling the gap in the short run. The borrowing to finance the big project, and then which is the sources is foreign financing, including also the municipal bond. The local government should talk with the central government. So the regulation is very prudent, so that all the risks is going to be managed in the beginning. This is some comparison with the other country. This is the total transfer compared to the total expenditure from the center. Indonesia, compared to the other country, is still quite well in the beginning of the process. Less than, in the year of 2011, less than 30%. But right now, in the year of 2012, the share has reached more than 35%. This is the, if we are talking about the central and local revenue and expenditure profile from the local government. See the graph in above, the central government revenue compared to the local government own resource revenue. So if we are talking about the portion of the revenue collected by the center and revenue collected by the local local just collect range less than 10%. But see the graph in the bottom. If we are talking about the national expenditure, see that even the local tax is quite very small, but if we are talking about the spending of the local government, then mostly come from the central government. If we are talking about the type of the local tax, for the provincial tax, basically from tax related to the vehicle. And there are also say from local tax for the municipality in the hotel, restaurant, and others. So this is the main source of taxes managed by the local government. And the last slide, I think I would like to show to you. This is kind of the share of intergovernmental transfer in Indonesia. And from this graph, we see that more than 80% of the government spending come from the transfer from the local government. So in conclusion, we are still in the running process in the fiscal decentralization. We are very worried about the horizontal equity. Because of that, then we focus on the transfer. We are a little bit worried about the vertical equality, so that in the meantime, we are very prudent in giving the revenue sharing, even though there are a lot of demand, increasing of demand from the local government to have revenue sharing. We share already the personal income tax and then excise, property tax right now, But for the value-added tax and corporate income tax is still held by the central government. The problem behind that, for example, there are a lot of demand on the corporate income tax. If the government then devolve some of the corporate income tax to the local tax, the map is that 80% of the total revenue from the corporate tax is in Java. This is the most populated island in Indonesia. And 80% corporate income tax in Java is in Jakarta. So we are going to create problem and then share the revenue from the corporate income tax. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marwanto. So I think that we'll throw it open for discussion now. Maybe we could get a show of hands, people who'd like to say something, and we'll. Okay, so why don't you yes, Khalid? Okay, yeah. Why don't we just go around? So Nader, you didn't get to speak this morning, and you would like also. Okay, and okay. Why don't we put up your flag and we'll just go around. Okay. Mr. Nader.
Thank you very much. I think both the morning and afternoon presentation were really informative, particularly having me, struggling quite a lot to see how we can be in the organization I work for, can be more instrumental to understand how to transition and where to start from centralization to more of deconcentration. In relation to municipalities, constitutionally Afghanistan is a unitary system, but it allows some delegation of authority that if in case would be needed, particularly in the case of municipalities, they are recognized as subnational governance entities, which is not the case for other entities that we have. They are the budgetary units, but not the provincial government offices or district government offices. So they can manage, they can generate revenues, they can manage their budget, but the problem is that their budget and staffing should be approved by the center. Again, constitution in terms of accountability and governance part of municipalities, we should have elected mayor and elected council, but it's not happening. One, because of the capacity of the election commission to hold those elections. Second, the technical issues like boundary issue, still not resolved, which would be the case. But this organization, since its establishment, has come up with lots of good policies and programmatic approaches to help municipalities, in some cases, increasing their revenues by 300%, particularly in the big cities. But of course, still requires lots of further efforts because it's not only to generate revenues, but to manage, to administer those revenues, which is again the issue of capacity comes in. The issue of reinvesting those revenues, finding other sources of revenue increase, taxes increase in order to generate revenues. But the difference from many countries' municipalities we have is that they're only responsible for urban affairs, urban service delivery. So their revenues are not spent for education, their revenues are not spent for the rural development. The other problem we have is that the clarity of roles and functions of entities at the local level. Mayors are reporting to the governors, provincial governors. So we have the provincial municipality, we have the district municipality. So in total, 158 municipalities. So the role of the, influence of governor on the revenues makes the governor to get benefit of the resources they have, not for the benefit of the urban development, but for his own ways of looking in however he would manage those funds. So given this scenario, which is, compared to other local entities we have in the area of municipalities, an opportunity, but how to get that constitutional provision opportunity we have in the area of municipality and have the municipality as a case, a model case, to build on and make that understanding to the central government that local government can work, they can be effective in service delivery, and also to the population, because particularly when you bring up the issue of centralization, it can be seen differently from different entities. Politicians, they don't want to give power. People, they don't want to see decentralization to federalism, because they think that federalism is dividing the state into pieces. Technocrats, they don't know how to start and where to start. So I think the municipality case, given the constitution we have, given the revenues they're generating, with a little bit of more further capacity building, system building, and practices, sharing lessons from countries within the region, and further policy guidance, legal framework, we might be able to turn into the case model and will further, our efforts of deconcentrating the practices and more of authority delegation to the provinces and to the districts.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your nice presentation, Smoke. Just one of your point struck me when we are presenting, the lack of citizen trust in local government, leading to inadequate willingness to pay local taxes. In our case, in Bangladesh, particularly the rural local governments, there are almost 5,000. The lowest tier, the Union Parishad we call, with a population of 100,000 each, or more than that. So these local bodies, they depend mostly on the central government. And as I told in the morning, they got two types of grant from the central government. One is a block grant and one is on basis of performance. They are given some authority or power to raise local taxes, particularly from property and others. But usually they don't go for taxing the people. And again, the issue you have raised, the trust. Because they got grants from the government, they are not dependent, they are not accountable to the people. They are not dependent on the people after the election, in fact. So this is, in fact, it is like a vicious circle, because it is an old institution, more than 100 years, but it is not flourishing. And again, I found some similarity with Indonesia in this respect, that they are depending on the government grant. Even the Upajala Parishad, the higher tier, the Jela Parishad, the 64 district council we have, these are also depending on the government. And again, as it has been discussed in some cases, the politicians, particularly the member of parliament, they don't like to see powerful local bodies in districts and upajalas. Because if the district council consisting of 4 or 5 parliamentary seats, so if the district council is given more authority, more power, then member of parliament, they think that they are excluded from the local authorities. So this in fact creates problem in Bangladesh in strengthening the local government. But as you pointed out the question of mistrust, certainly we need to empower our local bodies, the rural local government. But what should be the way? One, that if we want to build trust among the local bodies and the people, that will take some time. There might be some intermediate path. There, as it was told in the morning, that one size may not fit all. But I think there are some ways and means that how to strengthen these local bodies, creating trust among the in fact, the voters and the local institutions. I think we can look for this way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have 3 questions to the main presentation and one issue on raised by ETISM. First, I take the observation made by ETISM on gap filling. Gap filling became very notorious in India because of the Finance Commission approach. This question was raised by Teresa also. But if you look into it, when the gap filling grant is in fact given by the Finance Commission, it is, would you call it gap filling or expenditure equalization? Because the way it is estimated, it is not what they spend, but what they should be spending. So when estimate projection is made, you don't just project what they have been spending. You project on normative basis. And then if there's a gap for the weaker states, then you get the grants, which is called gap filling. But would you call it gap filling, or would you call it expenditure equalization? That's the question. I've got 3 questions on Paul's presentation. What do you do if subnational government does not utilize the sources assigned to them for revenue mobilization? It is our experience in India, some of the states which are relatively better off do not use their source of revenue. In fact, even though they are better off, their tax GSDP ratio is much lower than all state average. What to do in that case? Second question regarding how do you ensure adequate revenue for subnational government while assigning taxes on the principle of minimization, minimum cost collection? In fact, this is precisely how the assignment of taxes between the center and the states was allocated. But when it was allocated, it is found that more elastic sources of revenue have been assigned to the central government and less elastic sources are given to the state government. But if you look at the principle of distribution, assignment between the central government and the state government, then you find that they clearly say it is on the ground of efficiency and economy. Economy of collection, administrative minimization, cost collection, economy, and integration of the national economy. These are the considerations on which this allocation was made. But when actually allocation is made, the central government is given much more elastic source of revenue, but the state government is given the less elastic source of revenue. How do you really compromise this? My third question is, what to do if relatively better off states do not spend adequately on providing basic services like education, health, and water supply? They have the resources, but they don't allocate. So one of our richest states in the country, they're doing very well in terms of growth and everything else. But when you look at the social sectors, education, health services, and human development index, they're one of the most backward states. So how do you handle this kind of issues? Thank you.
Mr. Paul, I have one question is bothering me since long. That may be a stupid one or reflecting my ignorance. Is there some model or some real case situation or a model which can be thought about where the collection and generation of the revenue is being carried out at the lowest tier of the governance and being, transfers are upward to the federal government? This idea came to my mind for the reason, if spending may be more effective, relatively more effective at the lower tier of governance, it may be equally true about the collection and generation of the revenue. Thank you.
Thank you. My observations from Ahmad is that there is a risk of the race to the bottom amongst local governments in terms of collecting their own taxes. There is the case in Vietnam also when the provinces are competing with each other to attract investment, because once investment gets in, local government get a bigger share of the share tax. In Vietnam, by the way, in Vietnam, we have income tax, VAT, both personal income tax and corporate income tax, VAT, special sales tax, share tax. So if business set up their office or a factory there, local government can get more share of the share tax. So they compete with each other by lowering property taxes, giving more exemptions or reductions. So I think it also reflects on the presentation by Teresa in Latin America. There is a recommendations for reducing the tax exemption or tax reductions, tax incentives in local governments. So my question is how to avoid that the race to the bottom among local governments, and follow that how to design the transfer system that truly reflects the tax effort of the local government. Because in the end, if you lower your own revenue, but on the other hand, you get bigger of the transfer, it will be equal among local governments. So it do not reward those with best effort in tax collections. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. First of all, I was wondering, coming back to this question Professor Ahmad pointed out, the key issue of policy framework. What do you do when you want to raise local revenues and transfers, but you have as base a very poor population, right? So you cannot exact additional taxes on those people you are supposed actually to be giving back because of the poverty situation there. But secondly, what happens when the economy, the principle of local tax system is territorial, right? But the economy is increasingly not territorially based. So how do you make that work? And that comes my third question, or my third confusion, is in many municipalities, the main potential source of new income has to do with non-renewable natural resources that are being extracted. Is that a local issue, or is it a national issue? And how you deal with that provided two things. One, it's a very easy way for enterprises, for example, to avoid national policy frameworks because they negotiate bilaterally with the local municipalities. So municipalities get some more income, but it can have a huge cost for the entire nation. And how you balance those things in order that, getting more income locally doesn't mean in the end that your country is going to pay these costs in the medium and long term. So how do you juggle with these structural restrictions of setting up such a territorially based taxation system for getting more revenue? And just a comment, in the case of Mexico, I just wanted to say, I didn't understand very clearly, obviously, why not being re-elected at the municipal level is such a big constraint. I understand that you cannot, apply structural changes if you're not going to be re-elected. So in my country, mayors can be eternally re-elected forever. You can be a mayor forever. There is no restriction to that. And still they don't do that. So it's perhaps it's a matter of understanding better what is the restriction really to impose those, you know, new or structural changes at the very, very local level. And is it efficient at all? It's perhaps my main question. Is it not better perhaps to concentrate in a very strong but territorially spread out, how do you say it, taxation administration to collect the revenue from the territorial base instead of trying to put it in every single little locality?
Thank you. In order to create better linkages between public services and local revenues, you suggested, Professor Smoke, that local government can consult with the taxpayer in a subnational level in order to agree temporary or extraordinary contribution for specific investments. So that means that you have to give local governments some taxation capabilities, tax rate management. What are the limits of that? Because you also said that it's not a good practice to have different level of taxes in adjacent territories. How much leniency we will give a municipality to manipulate the tax rate in order to establish this linkage? Thank you.
I have one short question I'd like to ask the participant from Mexico. I'd like to know some more detail about the reforming the old source revenue. I'd like to know how can Mexico can increasing the own source revenue of local authority from 10% to 12%, and I'd like to know how to. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Smoke, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank for first, I would like to express my appreciation to the ADB to make this event happen. And this morning, and I just thank for all previous speakers. And this morning, I am very happy to hear Professor Smoke raise and elaborate about Cambodian case. So perhaps, as far as I know, Professor Smoke and Mr. Dokno from Philippines, they used to be advisor in Cambodia in the field of decentralization, is it? And as far as I know, first I have a question directly to Professor Smoke regarding the political interference. Interference on what aspect within the decentralization context? And I just would like to share experience for Cambodia's both bad and good experience, because sometimes bad experience is a medicine for us. And before last decades, Cambodia is was in the conflict, civil war. So at that time, Cambodia is a long history of centralized. And when I was in university, I have never heard word decentralization at all. And after that, after we finished conflict, civil war in Cambodia, and then we have support from many development partners. At that time, as I remember, we started with the foundation of decentralization, but in fact it is not decentralization, but it is called SEILA program. SEILA means foundation stone. It is before building the house, we have to build foundation first. And then but we select only 5 provinces at the first step as a pilot program. Even though government have no financial support for the program, but we use donor funding. And I mean that we have to transfer, or we have to streamline the perception and the concept of decentralization among rural people. So that's why we use donor funding with a small project like rural roads or water supplies or small-scale irrigation, something like that. And then after having that experience, we start with, we have established, and we move from 5 provinces to another province, almost the whole country. And then we start with the National Committee, Decentralization and Deconcentration, including subnational democratic development. And when we, before moving to decentralization, I remember what Smoke speak about. Cambodian people do not trust government. But in addition, even government do not trust themselves, not only people. Because local government, sometimes they said that they can accept this function and they can do. But the central government do not agree. Even though local government, they accept, they have ability to perform some function. So, and then regarding the, I just would like to say with the revenue collection or revenue management, for Cambodian government, it is very hard to manage revenue. Even though last 2 years, even though central government or line ministry, they have their own single account, sometimes many accounts. So some account has been hidden, but I don't need to elaborate more, just hidden. And then the government try to perform financial management reform, and then we try to we try not to have more account for each line ministry, only single account. Now we can do that. So now I have heard that the concern from we have Department of Local Finance in the Ministry of Economic Finance, and they have concern about how to manage revenue and expenditure from local subnational level, because at subnational level it is very hard for to manage revenue and expenditure, because even though because in the province some development partner have many projects and the local government cannot capture all that. In fact, my agency as aid management coordination agency, we manage the whole aid in Cambodia and we have ODA database. But we have only lump sum the amount of money of each project and some disbursement only. So, for instance, why I said it is very difficult. For example, we have investment project, and even we have investment project ADB or some development partner, and some project we have counterpart fund, and then my agency just survey about the counterpart fund that contribute to the project, and we ask the information from economy and finance. For instance, one project, government have contributed. Ministry of Economy and Finance told me that this project has been contributed by government budget, for example, $10. When I asked the receiver, they said 11 or $12. So different. I asked the question, why that? So in conclusion, revenue and expenditure at subnational level is very crucial and it's very difficult to manage in Cambodia. Thank you.
I was just saying, Paul, if you don't mind, I know that a lot of questions were asked. If you could just repeat the question you're answering, so people see the context, that would be great. Thank you.
Right. I think we don't have a lot of time. Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't worry. We can. Don't worry exactly about the time. It's the end of the day, so.
Oh, okay. And I think there's some questions for everybody. So, and there's 3 more.
Professor Smoke, have you captured my question again? So, what's political interference on what aspect that to undermine or the bottleneck that to undermine the momentums of decentralization? You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I may put my question for tomorrow if you want, because it can be also discussed from the point of view of the expenditures. The issue that I want to share with you is with regard to the design of the specific grant or transfer to the local government and the role of the legislators in the budget discussion, the so-called pork barrel. Professor Smoke, maybe you can share the experience of the US or Latin American countries in this area. We know that the legislators are elected based on regions, so they have their constituencies, they owe those constituencies, they want to do the best for these constituencies. But unfortunately, in our parliament, and I think also in most of the countries, the parliaments, the members of the parliaments are divided sectoral base. They form the committee for industry, agriculture, etc. And that's the budget committee. So we always have the problem when we discuss the transfer, the specific transfer. Many members of the parliament, but especially the counterpart of the Ministry of Finance itself, they ask, what can I promise to my constituency? So they propose the kind of specific grants based on their constituencies. So I don't know, is a common practice? Can it be considered also? Is there any best practice to cope with this kind of problem?
Just a little question to Paul. I want to know if we don't have territorial GDP, how can we measure the tax effort? I want to know what is the potential of collect, but if you don't have information, how can we do that? Thank you.
Well, you are a tough group. You've asked us a lot of very impossible questions. I'm going to take a stab at a number of them, and some of them I think will come up again tomorrow, at Sham. And then I'm going to give each of you an opportunity too, because there were some questions specific on this. But the bottom line that many of these things come down to is what is the strategy for pursuing a decentralization policy in an environment where the conditions that we normally associate with decentralization don't exist. So, for example, your questions about the idea of experimenting with urban services. I guess a lot of it depends on how you set the system up. But there are some good examples, and I can talk to you. I can't give a detailed example now, but there are certainly some instances in environments where there were weak institutions and so forth, where particular kinds of pilot programs have set up conditions which have allowed, which have then morphed into actual reforms. So I think it's probably better if we talk about that bilaterally. Mr. Ahmed, on the citizen trust issue, I mean, this is, you can't develop citizen trust without having some of the characteristics that Teresa was talking about this morning. There has to be some autonomy over some resources, and you can either do it in a way where specific kinds of functions are assigned, or you can do it the way Cambodia did, where they weren't really worried about specific services being delivered at a very low level. They gave a set of transfers and set up a set of decision-making systems, which I think people came to trust that there was some transparency in the way that those things were being done. So there isn't an easy answer to your question, and I don't know the Bangladesh situation that well, but I thought that some of the programs, like your performance-based grant program, was supposed to be set up in a way that there was considerable discretion, and there were some consultative mechanisms and transparency mechanisms, so that it didn't just get captured in patronage-style relationships and so forth. So again, I think we can discuss bilaterally, but I think that the bottom line is that the only way that you can break out of this cycle that you're talking about is by, even if it's a fairly modest kind of thing, having some genuine autonomy and transparency that begins to change the rules of the game and the way that people perceive that they interact with the local governments. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do, and there has to be, somebody has to want to do it. And this also, I think, Professor Sarma, your questions are also very difficult in this regard, because you want to know if subnational governments have access to revenues and they're not raising those revenues and they're not making the expenditures that they're supposed to be making, what do you do? Well, if this isn't happening, there are two ways to make this happen from some type of discipline from above or some type of discipline from below. And it's difficult in a federal system because the center maybe has less leverage, and Sham, I'll let you, I think maybe you could speak to this, but the center maybe has less leverage over what the states do. And I think it gets back to the rules of the game and so forth. And again, somebody has to want this to happen and begin to at least take steps to try to address it. If there were a way to use things like performance-based transfers, and I don't know what the options are in India, but Ehtisham is going to talk more about this tomorrow. And the issue of the types of revenues which go to the subnationals, well, the elastic bases do tend to be more appropriately collected at higher levels. Now, in India, one would assume this is the states as well, but I think that the way that the tax system gets set up depends on the kinds of issues that Etisham was talking about earlier. And there isn't, again, this is somewhat context specific. So I don't feel like I can say more than that at the moment, but maybe someone else would like to. Just quickly on a few other points, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel. This idea of the revenue being collected at the lowest level, well, I mean, sometimes for certain types of taxes this is done, but it means setting up all of this duplicative administration and having all this capacity. I think that there are certainly there's certainly some cases where this has been done, but I think that it probably in most cases is going to violate some of the basic principles that we were talking about before in terms of administrative efficiency and so forth. On the property tax, they compete with each other. I mean, one of the things I would want to know here is how important are these taxes in the bottom line of these businesses? Because frankly, I don't know about the European experience. Maybe Teresa Etisham can talk more about this. But the research in the United States is unambiguous. All these things do is lose local government's revenue. They don't actually, the taxes, local taxes are not big enough in the decision-making structures of firms which locate because of access to resources, because of access to labor, because of access to markets, because of access to transport, other things that are much more important. And the general sense, the general policy sense in the U.S. has certainly been that this is a terrible practice, that very few firms, that this is not a major issue for them on the margin. Now, the one exception is in immediate metropolitan areas where people, proximate areas where firms there might be a little bit more wiggle room in terms of this kind of tax competition. But it's generally considered to be bad practice. And in fact, in the States, in response to some firms which were attracted by tax breaks, which then didn't hire as many people as the local government expected, or the firm moved or something like this, some state and local governments are negotiating contracts with these firms, making sure that they stay and deliver a certain levels of benefits, and if they don't, then they have to pay back taxes and so forth. So it's a messy set of issues. Okay, on the issue, Etisham, I think I'm going to punt Karen's question to you, because you have a lot more experience with the non-renewable resource taxation. If that's okay, I could make some comments, but I think you'll have a better sense of it. And Roberto, I didn't mean a temporary. I meant this as a way in some countries and even specific cities where local governments already have the power to raise property taxes, but they're not charging them because they're politically problematic for them to collect. That one way to get people to begin paying what they're supposed to pay is by starting with a kind of a negotiation over specific things that begin to get people on a trajectory of having this quid pro quo relationship with the local government. So I think I gave the example, and sometimes it's larger scale things with the Chamber of Commerce, which is complaining about bad roads or water in an industrial area. But I've also seen it on smaller scales where, for example, there's a lot of public markets in sub-Saharan Africa, and so the local government negotiates with the market. You want running water? You want a clean market? We have to negotiate the fees that you pay to use the market. So I wasn't suggesting this as an extraordinary thing. I was suggesting it as an icebreaker in beginning to try to figure out ways to to demonstrate to citizens that they're getting some value for the revenues that they're paying to subnational governments. I think, well, maybe on the Cambodia issue, I could speak for too long on that. I think, why don't we deal bilaterally with that so I can turn it over to some of the other panel. And I think that this issue of how you set up specific grants, there just shouldn't be this kind of discretion. There is a lot of this type of behavior, and in fact, our colleagues from the Philippines can tell us it's a different quality kind of thing, but the constituency development funds, which have been picked up in other countries, I personally think that that in many instances these things are problematic because they complicate lines of accountability. The issue is, what is the money being provided for? And if it's being provided for something that a local government is responsible for, then the parliament shouldn't have anything to do with it other than setting up the rules, I think. And I think we could have a long discussion about this, and maybe we can talk about this issue tomorrow in Etsham's presentation. So why don't I stop there and Teresa, maybe you want to say something?
Well, I just want, I mean, very briefly, because I think that actually the issues are more pertinent to what Etisham is going to talk about tomorrow. But on the question of how do you encourage government, I mean, local or regional government to use their tax base to provide services, you know, and their taxing power to provide services. Well, I would say transparency is very important in that respect. I mean, because transparency is the basis for what is called yardstick competition. I mean, if the citizens of a state see that the neighboring state or another state is receiving much better services with the same tax burden that they are sort of having to pay, they will penalize their local politicians. The problem is that often this information is not available. There is very little basis for comparison of the quality of the service, the quality and quantity of the services that are being provided at by different jurisdictions in either at the regional or at the local level. Clearly, when this is applicable, yardstick competition requires a clear definition of spending responsibilities. When the spending responsibilities are murky, when it's not clear who is supposed to be delivering a certain type of services, then competition cannot work. And so I think this is something that also Etisham is going to be discussing tomorrow.
You've answered a lot of the questions. Let me start with Professor Sarma's thing about gap filling. If my recollection of Govinda Rao's paper, which he did for a book I edited some years ago, he was thinking of automatically meeting deficits of local governments. In that case, it's straightforward, incentive incompatible in a sense. The way you were putting it in terms of looking at standardized spending and revenues, well, that doesn't affect behavior directly. So in that sense, indeed, all the equalization systems match standardized spending with standardized revenues. That's not gap filling in the sense that it doesn't induce adverse behavior by the recipient governments. But if you were meeting deficits directly, or you had factors which were under the control of the state or local governments getting the transfers, in that case then you would end up approximating the gap filling and the fiscal dentistry, which both Anwar Shah and Govinda Rao have talked about. So I think there's a slight difference in terms of the way you do it that affects behavior. Mr. Abdul Khalik was talking about collecting revenues at the subnational level. There are externalities in tax collection, which is why the broad-based taxes are easier to collect at a higher level. Now, to some extent, this comes back to a question from this side of the floor. A lot of the modern theories, you know, there was a territorial discussion in the normative literature, but the political economy literature has changed the focus a little bit, in that you want to perhaps think of the mobile bases perhaps as being more appropriate to local jurisdictions, because they tend to provide greater discipline on local politicians. You know, if you have a mobile base and you are inefficient in collecting it or managing it, then you'll go somewhere else. So you lose revenues if you're not careful, and that's why a lot of the modern literature has changed the emphasis away from territoriality as a basis for determination of local taxation. But the issue of externality still arises, and therefore one would tend to argue that things like the value-added tax in particular are not such good candidates for being managed at the subnational level, even though, you know, the modern theory suggests that you might want to consider it. But, you know, you can consider a value-added tax, or you know, even a surcharge on an income tax, which is a mobile base, but without necessarily having a local administration. So you can still think of making use of the externalities with the high-level administration, but having the tax base or the tax rate determined at the lower level, which makes it, particularly, say, the surcharge on the income tax, actually a rather nice base for subnational administration. So I think there is now a shift in the literature, particularly regarding tax competition, and quite a lot of work on accountability and the political economy of taxation, where the old theories are being modified. On natural resources, again, there's some work that suggests that you have a lot of risk-sharing issues involved, and therefore you might want to think of shared taxation, particularly for things like carbon-based taxes. But because you have, again, negative externalities associated with certain types of carbon taxes, you can think of it as an onion. You probably want some sharing with higher levels, and perhaps that's the way it's also done in Indonesia and other parts of the world. But you might also want to think of a production-specific excise, which goes to the local government dealing with the negative externalities of extraction in the region. So, you know, you can think of it as an onion rather than just one tax. You can think of a series of, you know, either production sharing arrangements or production sharing income taxes, plus a production excise, which go to different levels of government. And then, of course, you have the issue of setting the shares, which is not easy, as we've seen in the Indonesian case. You know, you had the very interesting case of Aceh, and of course, sharing of petroleum and gas resources in Indonesia started off with, correct me if I'm wrong, Pak Nasution and Pak Marwanto, you started off with a single sharing arrangement. But Aceh said, well, no, this won't do. So then you went back and said, well, let's say that onshore is 20 miles into the sea. And they said, no, that's not enough. So instead of 25, it became 45. They said, no, not enough. So 45, no, how about 50? They said, no, that's not enough. So 75 for Aceh and, was it East Kalimantan? No? And then that's how you ended up with with asymmetric sharing of petroleum resources. It's a political issue. The difficulty is, when you start the sharing, is that the producing region can always do better with 100%. Now, but in this arrangement, you look at the balance between the costs of secession and provision of public services and security and so on against the benefits you would get from 100% shares of natural resources. So it's not an easy one. There's a pure political economy element keeping countries together in this equation, which yields quite often asymmetric arrangements, as Indonesia has shown. But they now have a workable solution. It's to some extent they've clawed it back by the way they have handled the equalization framework by including it into the equalization formula. So that was rather clever, but it makes the equalization system somewhat problematic for reasons that a number of us have been talking about. So it's not an easy issue, but it's one that you want to look at in the context of the particular case. And there are some very good examples of where it is a problem, and also different countries handle it differently. Just contrasting Colombia with Indonesia, for instance, is a very useful way to begin, because there are different treatments in the management of natural resources in these two cases. Let me see what else. I think the issue of the specific grants, etc., we can come to tomorrow. The issue of territorial bases. See, you may lack information on territorial GDP, but you do have quite often very good information on bases. And you can look at the base for, say, income tax or the value-added tax, and then, or even property taxes. And then, that gives you some information that you can begin to utilize. And as the Australians have, correctly pointed out in setting up equalization frameworks, if you put the requirement of the information in, it's surprising how quickly the local governments provide the information. But there's the other lesson that people draw from Australia is that very complex equalization frameworks tend to lose the neutrality that equalization framework should have in terms of behavior. So I think the Australian system had become far too complex, and China did very much better in adapting the Australian model with a much simpler model for equalization. And it's a very good model that you should look at. And what the Australians have been doing is actually to move towards a Chinese model by simplifying the modified, moving towards a modified Australian model by simplifying the factors and going for much simpler information. And you can do quite well if you focus on 3 or 4 key issues like population, characteristics, demographics, and all of these things which are basically driving your cost factors. That information is generally available and can be utilized quite effectively together with the information on tax bases. You have information on costs and you've got information on the revenue basis, and then you can utilize it for a simple development of an equalization framework, as the Chinese have done very effectively. Though, in the Chinese case, I'm sure you will hear about it tomorrow, is that they started off with a relatively small proportion of income going towards the equalization framework, which is now being expanded. And there were other elements in the Chinese transfer system, which were largely due to the whole harmless conditions in 1994, which were used to guarantee every province that they would do no worse with the reforms than they did in 1993. So there was a very large proportion of hold harmless, which was a lump sum, and then there was also revenue return to, there was a very clever idea, was this revenue return, even though it's been criticized by some of the international agencies, including the World Bank. But if you look at what the Chinese did in 1993, they had brought in a new tax system from afresh, which had gainers and losers. And they had this whole harmless condition, which the Mexicans used very nicely in 2007, and we discussed it with the Mexicans, in bringing in another major tax reform in Mexico. But the Chinese gave back very substantial revenues to regions that were generating income and were criticized by the World Bank, amongst others, for disequalizing. But look at what the Chinese were trying to do, and this is the very, very clever thing that Zhu Rongji did, was to make sure that there was no break in the production system, because a lot of the growth centers in China were along the coast. And the whole strategy, the economic strategy of China, was to maintain the growth process. So you couldn't have a new tax system coming in and a new equalization framework that all of a sudden moved all the resources away from the coast. Would have been a major disaster. So what the Zhu Rongji and Liu Jiwei did was to bring in the revenue return system, which has gradually declined over time. That was to protect the growth generation power of the coastal area. And of course, what they have done subsequently is to correct by moving directed investment to the interior. And as soon as the investment strategies and the road and rail and transportation network has been able to handle trade, production has moved inland. It hasn't moved all the way to the west, but that's where the additional investment that's being carried out, the targeted transfers for investment purposes, are actually doing quite well. So they're moving investment towards the interior, but what they did in 1994 was absolutely brilliant, was to bring in an equalization framework, maintain a hold harmless clause, and at the same time make sure that there was no disruption in the growth pattern. So it was actually very well done, and we were privileged to have been associated with it. So again, it depends on what countries are trying to do, how much of a break you're making. Can you cut the Gordian knot? And this is a question for countries like Brazil and Mexico. You're stuck with an inefficient value-added tax in Brazil and in Mexico. Can you cut the Gordian knot? And that's partly a political issue. And can you come up with simple solutions, as the Chinese did, and to be honest, the Mexicans did with the smaller tax, the IETU, which plugged the holes in the corporate income tax, but on a value-added tax basis. Had they used the same effort to fix the value-added tax in 2007, they would have had better benefits, because even though the IETU has blocked the hemorrhage in the corporate income tax, the problem is in the value-added tax. The Mexican corporate income tax generates 3% of GDP, which is more or less average for the OECD. The value-added tax generates 3% of GDP with a 16% rate, and the efficiency of that is as poor as Pakistan, which is one of the worst in the world. It's 25%. So, the rate, so basically the big gap, the revenue gap in Mexico is the value-added tax, which is also losing them information which is needed for the corporate income tax. And then you have to think through, if you are going to fix the value-added tax, what do you do for the states? Because you would then have to take away the repecos. And you're blocking the loopholes, so you have to give them either a piggyback on the income tax or generalize, say, a business tax at the local level. So one has to, if one were thinking through a tax reform agenda for the Mexican case, it has to involve not just federal taxes where you're plugging the holes, but subnational taxation, both at the state level, particularly at the state level, but also sort of rationalizing both the property tax and the business tax to replace the repecos for local governments, very local governments, and then you need something for the states. So that's the. Repecos are I think I explained it in my talk. It's a tax on small taxpayers. Both the income tax and the value-added tax is taxed on a small fee basis, and the evasion for the repecos is 90%, 95%. This is an estimate done by Hacienda and also by SAT. So this is not collected. So basically, it's given to local governments, not collected. They have no interest in collecting it, and it's just a hole in the tax system that is creating a mess, together with other gaps in the Mexican taxes. It's a very interesting set of issues, but no solution for Mexico can be found. As two finance ministers, or three, at least two finance, Gil Diaz tried to fix it. Carstens, I think, tried and gave up. And then, Cordero tried, or he decided he wasn't going to touch it. Right. He decided he wasn't going to touch it. So I guess the new government has an opportunity, a political window, to try and get something done. And they have to, because oil revenues are going down. And you can't run a country of the size and complexity of Mexico with a 10% tax GDP ratio. It's half it's half the Latin American average. It's not even close to Brazil or Chile, for that matter. Pakistan is another example where they were stuck on the tax reform. It's partly an issue of the tax assignments and the exemptions, and the fact that both Pakistan and India have inherited split bases from the British. There's the Government of India Act 1935 split all the important bases. Agriculture, non-agriculture, income is not treated as income, though some movement has been made in India to fix that. Pakistan has made no movement at all. And the split base on the value-added tax, the sales tax, both in India, Pakistan, create huge problems for both countries. So really, these are very difficult issues, and any solutions have to start with the federation, what the federation does, what can be done at the provincial or state level, and then what's done at the local level. Because again, there's been a lot of work done by the ADP on decentralization, but no one has been looking at appropriate sources of revenues at the subnational level, particularly at the local level. And rationalization, property taxes, land taxes, service and business taxes on Latin American models really have to be looked at very carefully. And then also both fixing the federal gap and provincial intermediate options. There hasn't really been any substantive work on those issues. So again, if you're thinking of work on the tax policy side, there's a huge amount to be done. And then the question, who trusts whom on the administration, and do you really need to have a value-added tax administration at 5 levels of government? You don't. So how do you create an arm's-length administration? Can you do a solution like the Chinese did? And the Chinese, again, were very pragmatic. Again, thanks, the example of Zhurongji, they created a central tax administration in 1993 and negotiated a value-added tax to be administered by the central tax administration. For the first time in Chinese history to have a central tax administration. All the provinces agreed, except for one. Shanghai refused. And Zhurongji had been mayor of Shanghai. And they said, all right, just collect it for us. So, you know, even in China, there was a political constraint. So, you know, one does recognize that you may have to cut some corners. But there are solutions, and there are out-of-the-box solutions. I don't think anyone is saying that, you know, copy Brazil, or Brazil has problems, or the United States, or Germany. Germany has problems. You know, their German intergovernmental reforms in 2005, 2006 failed. They tried to get rid of the overlapping spending. It didn't work. They tried to fix the tax administration and the tax policy assignments and reporting. They got virtually nothing because they were doing every reform individually. And with every reform that you do individually, you have gainers and losers. And unless you put them all together, you can't make this political economy choices. So in a sense, it's better to do what the Indonesians did. You go in one go and do the whole thing, and then make adjustments. But then, or the Chinese did, you know. You do a reform, you look at the effects, you compensate by the transfer system. It's not complete in China, because in China you still have work to be done on the spending assignments. Major work to be done on the spending assignments. You've done a lot on the treasury, but you know that's not sufficient. You need to be looking also budget coverage. I think we'll stop.
We're running late, but I think that we should give Emilio and Marwanto, if they have anything that they wanted to respond to.
Well, I'll answer to the question from Karen on my comment about the re-election of majors. When I mentioned that I think that if majors were to be re-elected, that would be that would probably be an incentive to improve the collection of the property tax. I did not imply that it was the only factor that was influencing the property tax collection. Obviously, some municipalities that are poorer and don't have the infrastructure or the means to collect taxes would be well advised to delegate the collecting efforts to another body. For instance, the municipality could delegate the collection of the taxes to the state level. No? But certainly the inability of the mayors to get reelected is a binding constraint in their planning in the medium term. If you're not going to be there, if you're going to be there only for 3 years, you don't have the incentive to pay the cost of raising revenues. So it's not the only issue, but it's definitely a major issue. And one way you can look at that is the only place in Mexico that property taxes are collected properly is Mexico City. And Mexico City is the only place where the mayor is elected for 6 years. And you might say, well, Mexico City is the richest city in the country. Well, it's not. You have other cities like Monterrey, which are richer than Mexico City, and they collect significantly less property taxes. So I think there's pretty strong evidence that this is a binding constraint.
Well, just one issue concerned by Professor Sharma. The question is related, what is the sanction for the subnational government if then the performance could not be achieved? Well, in the case of Indonesia, as long as the transfers in the form of the block grant, the general purpose grant, so the promise is to the local people there. So there will be political sanction, meaning that, well, in the next term, she or he is not going to be appointed to be the mayor or the governor. But in terms of specific grant, then there will be kind of sanction from the local government. Then if then the performance of the specific grant transfer to certain local government is not performed, is going to be one of the criteria to allocate for the next year. If then the problem is that related to the accountability in managing the money, related to the financial management, then they will be post-audit. And then the one that doing the wrong decision, or then they are doing the corruption, then they will be punished by the regulation. Thank you.
Well, thanks for all your questions. I'm sorry we ran a bit over, but I think that I realize that we have not even begun to satisfactorily answer your questions, but I think we have a lot of good issues out on the table, and we'll continue these discussions. And I wanted to make just one comment about tomorrow. What we're hoping to do in the final major session tomorrow that Etisham is going to lead is to try to pull some of these things together a bit more. We had originally had the expenditure piece because of our finance follows function. It was originally this afternoon. And then we thought that let's get the basic framework and the revenue issues out, and then through expenditure management and specialized type transfers that try to encourage better expenditure and performance and so forth, we can pull together some of the framework and revenue generation and transfer issues. So I think that many of these issues we will have an opportunity to return to tomorrow. And thank you very much for a very interesting and productive session.
Christina, you wanted me to say something? Departure? Oh, tomorrow, yes, I think the bus will leave the hotel at 8 o'clock tomorrow, same time as today. Anything else? Okay, and today, where's the bus? In the front? Okay. Thank you.
Great, we made it.
Yes. I wanted to just